Good afternoon. It's Mo here, going live in the group. Actually, it's not quite the group. I'll explain that in a minute. But yeah, going live, I want to talk about something that comes up fairly often. And I also want to close the gap that's probably existing for some of you in terms of neuroplasticity. There's actually two gaps. So I would say when you think about neuroplasticity, and the way I talk about it a lot in my content, it's that we didn't have the brain imaging tools available when emotional intelligence was created. Certainly before that, all the subconscious mind language. In fact, myelin wasn't really understood that it wasn't just an inert matter. That was in the 50s. Now, that may seem like a long time ago, but when you consider we got a 300,000-year-old brain, it's been evolving all that time. 99% of that 300,000 years has been without the technology and the machines and the information, etc. So neuroscience, as we know it today, is very much in its infancy. And that's the challenge, because the researchers are still building on on previous research, and to get funded and peer reviewed. Those are very narrow lanes that those folks have to go down. When I was going through the training and talked to neuroscientists face to face, they were 100% clear that yeah, it's not a mind, it's a network of neurons, 100%. And I asked, so why are we still calling it a mind? And you'll see the eyes roll back in their head. But the point is, think about all the textbooks, think about all the narratives, the jobs. There's so many things that are tied in to the subconscious being a mind. As a matter of fact, if you look at books, and these are books by people who know, I know that they know, but they still call it a mind. Why? Can't tell you, but probably because in order to get past the committees that are associated with publishing a book, you're going to have to meet some particular standards. I ran into that same thing when I was doing motorcycle training, because there's physics terminology, and then there's terminology that lay people use, and it has to be said a certain way, but it gets in the way of understanding. And that's why I do this work, and that's why I set up the group, because in this group we can talk about it and dissect it. And once you see it, once you see the things that I've been seeing, you can't unsee it, and it locks it in. And also, if you're like most people who are interested in this topic, you probably can't come up with your own narrative as to how does the subconscious mind interact. And I don't usually call it a mind, but I'm just role playing. How does the subconscious interact with the conscious? And I mean, I've had people argue that the subconscious is the higher self, the subconscious only sees in pictures. And while all those things are partially, well, not the higher self, it's sub because it's below. But what I want to do is talk about why some of these gaps exist. So first, there's two parts. There's the brain and central nervous system neuroplasticity, and that's what's new. That's what's based on the brain imaging. And then there's the physiological neuroplasticity that has to do with like muscle memory. And most of us have used muscle memory. We've applied it. We've done it. We've done deep practice, even if we didn't know that's what we were talking about. When you start separating a large task into smaller tasks and drill those smaller tasks, whether it's music or sports, you're engaging in deep practice. There's some other factors like intention and precision and balance or complexity, intensity, struggle at the edge of ability. There's some things that you do, and that communicates to the central nervous system that this is very important. And that's what creates the myelination. So that was known before. What was not known is that applies to the brain and the central nervous system as well. That's what I was talking about in the 1950s. They realized that the myelin in the brain is not inert matter. It's actually related to the habits. And a habit is really just a set of associations, and the path of least resistance is what's the habit. The habit pattern is the path of least resistance. So when I talk about neuroplasticity, from that perspective, I'm talking about replacing those old paths with the desired path, the one that's aligned with our quest. That's the path of least resistance that becomes the new habit pattern. Now, the second part, there's another area. So that was the central and peripheral, or think of brain/nervous system and physical and tissues. And then you have the other dimension, which is more like a layer, and that's homeostasis. and allostasis. So homeostasis is stabilizing at the status quo. Allostasis is stabilizing on an upward trajectory and change. So if you look at it, the best example that I think most people can relate to, if you ever pay attention to what through hikers do, these are people who are going from like Mexico to Canada or reverse, or from the south of the country to the north of the country. Basically 2,000 and 3,000 mile hikes that last somewhere around 75 to 90 days. At the beginning of the hike, they're working hard and they're only doing about 8 to 10 miles a day. 30 days later, they're doing 30 miles a day, 10 days in a row. That's allostasis in action. It's what's happening is the signal is getting stronger and more efficient. So the same way that homeostasis creates stability at the status quo by driving for efficiency, allostasis is building efficiency on an upward trajectory. That's why if you look at the through hiker at before and after pictures or video or whatever, they look slightly different, but it's not like they've massively changed. It's the same thing that knowledgeable fitness trainers do with their clients to not hit the plateau. They blow through the plateau without the plateau ever being there, because the homeostasis is kicking in and creating that leveling off, but they're acting preemptively so that they don't hit the plateau. They just keep going up. Now, when you look at neuroplasticity, you're going to find more information about the physiological neuroplasticity, and that stands to reason because that has been around for a longer time. And muscle memory by the way, is not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, but that's been around for a longer time, and it's easy to understand because you basically have the glutamate, which is a signal from the central nervous system to the neural pathway. Then you have the neural pathway, that's synapses, and then you have the acetylcholine. And so those are 3 different kinds of neurotransmitters, but it's very easy to see. You can measure it, you can look at it, etc. Right? When you get into the brain, it becomes more difficult. The other thing that happens, and this is just from talking to so many people about this, is that when you first start hearing it, you are literally trying to understand it with the same system that we're talking about. Now, you've probably seen my picture of the two models, the network of neurons side A and the conscious mind side B. So the network of neurons engages much earlier than the conscious awareness, or much earlier, half a second earlier than the conscious awareness. It's a lot when you think about how much is processed. 5 million bits of information can be processed in that half second. And so it colors the information that's coming in. It's very difficult to understand. This is what I work through with clients. So essentially what I do with a client, I first have an exit, right? We got to take the exit ramp to get out of the status quo, what they've been doing, change in their vernacular, change their meaning of words. And everybody's different, but essentially I do an exit ramp to break some of the habits. The other thing I have to do is whatever is causing them to be incoherent, I solve that first, because you can't really do much with neuroplasticity if there's incoherence at play. It can still work, but it takes a lot longer. What you need is high coherence and calm, basically alpha, if you can, alpha brainwave state, if you can. Obviously it'll work in beta, but it's much better in alpha. And it's almost like cells. If cells were in fight or flight, in protective mode, they can't seek nutrients. So cells are either in growth configuration or in protective configuration. They can't do both. And when we're working with neuroplasticity, what are we working with? Cells. So when people are stressed out, it's very difficult for the neuroplasticity to happen. So first thing I have to do is get an expanse of coherence. And once I have that coherence, I can then start chipping away, and we basically just keep running laps, and each lap we remove a different weak link. And I'll talk about how we do that. That's essentially what I do with the 7-step reset. So those are the 2 sides and 2 layers, the central or brain versus the physiological, and then the homeostasis versus the allostasis. The reason that's important is because most of what you're going to find around neuroplasticity has to do with getting back to status quo. It's when people fall down, whether it's geriatric stuff or injuries, physical therapy, it's all about getting back to normal. Very, very little in this space around above the line, and probably because of the way it's funded. Research is funded by hospitals and education, etc. People who are looking to get more out of life are not funding these kinds of studies. And I think there's another dimension, and as I was talking about with the subconscious mind confusion, that it's a mind for a lot of people. So before I jump in, I want to encourage you to leave comments. If you're seeing this, you're probably not seeing it at the time I'm doing it because it's not in the group. I'm going to post it to the group. But I encourage you to leave comments because I use those comments and any feedback to inform the next event, if you will. Now, the plan is I'll go live unless I'm out of town or something. I've tried going live when I'm out of town and it just doesn't work. There's so many variables and can't guarantee the lighting in the hotel, and I could fix it by carrying around more lighting, but then I'm checking bags and you get it. And even when you do all of that, you still have suspect signal and different things. But normally I'll go live every Thursday, and if I'm going to be out of town and I can do it, I'll do it like a Wednesday night or something, and then still publish it on Thursday at 8 o'clock because I can do that. But normally I'll be live because I want to be there and have people come on stage if you want and talk, or you just put questions in the chat and we interact that way. But I do want to be responding because everybody learns this stuff differently, and I've been working on this for 5 years. And so when I hear a question, I probably have answered it before, but I'm not necessarily thinking about every single thing. So the comments, it's like pulls the stuff out of me, which is a good way to do this. I am setting up a database of research, and I do have the library, but there's like almost 200 videos, 40 to 45 to 60 minutes long, and I need to categorize it so that it's more actionable and usable. All right, so let's see. Okay, now what I'm going to do is talk about this, where I was talking about the stress configuration. So I think you can get that part, that when cells are under or in stress, they close in, they go into a protective configuration. And you can see, if you read like the book Heart Math Solution, you can see how this can lead to some of the things that we're talking about in that research, where people become ill because they're suppressing things. And we all know, we've heard of people, some correlations being made between cancer or resentment and cancer, things like that. So there is an issue with the cells staying in protective mode for too long. Same thing with people, and you'll hear coaches talk about, and you may say this yourself, that you can't really create great plans in a place of stress. And when you take it a step further, you say, okay, if you're in stress, you're probably going to be more like in fixed mindset or chaos, as I sometimes draw. Because if you have a lot of coherence, there's very little room for coherence and for chaos and rigidity. So rigidity is like fixed mindset, and chaos is just like all over the place. And what we want is to have more coherence. So it's the fixed mindset is like that rigidity and or chaos. Either way, it's less coherence, it's low heart rate variability. You're not going to be able to do much in that state. So this is what we're talking about today. Right now, if I go to pull this in, first talk about the pressure curve. This is inverted U, and it's 1908, I think this thing was created, is the inverted U, and it had to do with another area now. I call it the pressure curve. Quite a few people call it the pressure curve, but essentially you have this optimal pressure here, and this is where we're in the zone. This is like flow state. This is where we are optimized. When you come down over here, this is disengaged. You're low arousal, underwhelmed, not engaged, boredom, apathy, understimulation. This is the part over here where you're trying to get going and you just can't do it. So this is low performance over here. And the difference between this side and this side is just not, it's just like low energy. This side could be high energy, but it's negative. So this might be low energy. It could be negative, could be positive, but it's low. And you don't have enough juice to make something happen. Over here, you have high energy, and it's just too much arousal, overwhelmed, overstimulated. And here's where we want to manage. Now, as an individual, you want to manage yourself so you're here. And there's ways to do it. You can take breaks, you can shift things, move between operation and strategic. There's different things you can do. But I would say more is because I will, in this group, speak as though most people have some affiliation with coaching, some sort of a role with coaching or development of leaders, because that's who I'm attracting into the group. And when I'm working with the client, if I see them fall down here or fall down here, I stop. We change gears. We talk about something else, because I can't get progress if they're over here. Here, they're just not engaged. We might reschedule. Here, I just change the subject. I'm very, very aware of when they slip over this little line. It's all imaginary, of course, but when they slip over that line, it's if I stay there, next thing you know, it's going to be cortisol and adrenaline, and then we're cooked. So I come back and I just change the subject. I'll make a note, and then the next time we meet, I'll bring it up, but I'll position it in a way that I don't trigger the fight or flight. So we want to stay in here. Now, if we look at that same slide, but we look at it as performance view. So this first one was the performance view. I'm sorry, this is the performance view. The other one was the mental state view. So we had the mental state view, and now we're going to look at the performance view. So the performance view, poor and below average, as you would expect, and then heading to collapse. So I have 5 levels of agency, and the 5 levels of personal leadership, and the top is expansion. Now, you're not going to be in expansion all the time. This is like an athlete when they raise the level of the game. Expansion is when you can make major strides in towards your quest. Below that, we have agency. And agency is one that we can stay in 24/7 by using some of the techniques or the tactics and tools I'm going to talk about today. And then below that, you have stabilize. So that's in the middle. That's where most people are trying to stay, but they fall down into destabilize, the one below that. My objective with clients is to be in agency with dropping down into stabilize. So we take destabilized out of play completely. And how do we do it? We do it with neuroplasticity. How does that work? We make the path of least resistance those interventions and actions that keep us in agency. If you allow yourself to go into destabilized, that's a path, that's a set of associations that leads to that. And the bottom one is collapsed. So collapse is like a phobia response, or it looks like, and a catastrophization, and basically a person's crashed out. We don't want anybody in collapse. And when people crash out, and by the way, this is not scientific, but I know Joan Rosenberg talks about it in her book. There's a sense that one of the reasons why people don't go after the things that they believe they can achieve is because they have this fear of crashing out. Most people have an anxiety spiral at one point in their life. They never wanted to do it again because it's the out of control. Well, even an anxiety spiral can be mitigated with neuroplasticity. A lot of what drove my study is between martial arts. I was an Army Ranger, completed the school Army Ranger training, trained with Rangers, trained with Navy SEALs, and then between that and then martial arts. And I would look for what's the first principles kind of view that meets the litmus test when I compare it to what Navy SEALs and martial, because I trained with the martial arts master as well. What's the first principles thinking that keeps those things in play as we go through this? And that's why I talk about allostasis. So allostasis, as I said, trajectory, stability on an upward trajectory. Most of what you're going to find is homeostasis, because people are not funding that, as I said. But if you look at through hikers, dancers, yoga, martial arts, Navy SEALs, Rangers, all these people are applying some level of allostasis. And interestingly enough, the 2 groups of people who seem to have heard about allostasis are physical therapists, because they're using allostasis to go from here back up to status quo, but they're not using allostasis the way I talk about it to transform and go above the line. And the other group is those working with geriatric patients, because they're trying to stave off dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that. So it's using an allostasis kind of thing. Basically, allostasis, the brain is always predicting how much demand is coming, and with allostasis, when it's under predicting over a period of time, it then starts generating more neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter, obviously dopamine and serotonin. Serotonin's feel good. Dopamine not only is the habit formation, but it's also a signal amplifier. So when you have more dopamine, you have a stronger signal. And what I was saying before, I didn't finish the point, that there's signal and there's muscle. If you look at a client, if you're a fitness instructor, and you look at a client and that client hits a plateau, that plateau is more signal than it is muscle. This is why, as I said, you can break through those plateaus by changing up the exercise routines. You can train the signal, which is why you see some power lifters can lift massive amounts of weight and they look small because they've trained the signal. It's a strong signal. Now, this has been around for a longer time, obviously, as I said, on physiological topics, less so in the cognitive. But when you apply it to cognitive, you see all kinds of breakthrough happening. So this is where I'm talking about this side here, about how do we change that so people don't fall down. They don't fall down into this little problem. So if you take if you take a baseline, and we say we got the baseline here, and then we're going along on a good day, right? I talk about a good day of a good week and a bad day of a bad week because everyone has a plan, but we want plans that work on a bad day of a bad week because very, very seldom, especially if you're doing innovation, things just don't always work out. You're going to have some hiccups. You're going to have some trial and error. And now with the amount of information coming at us, thanks to AI and other things and just technology in general, we have way too much information. So you're making more and more assumptions. It's not like you can do a SWOT and that SWOT analysis holds for 2 or 3 years. You do a SWOT analysis today, it could be obsolete in months. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're going to have to do more iterations, which is why I think this topic is more important than ever. So let's say, and that's why I talk about plans that work on a bad day of a bad week, but I also talk about iterative development. We're not designing for delivery. We're designing an exit, then we design an on-ramp, then we design the main highway, but it's all iterative, the same way we operate as humans. It's loops, constantly feedback loops, which is another reason why neuroplasticity is this confusion around it, because when you start looking at it from a scientific point of view, there's so much variation across people that scientists are loath to say it's this way or that way. That's why I use frameworks and models, because it enables us to have a language, and then we accept that it could be wildly different. So if you're going along, we have this kind of a, peaks and valleys, and that's just the normal idea. So this, if you're in coherence, you're doing things, I should say, if you're in a state of coherence and you're doing something that you're used to doing, not a lot of fear, not a lot of unknown, you can kind of see this happening. But then what will happen is, if you are in a more stressful environment or you get stressed, one of these might go a little higher and it doesn't come back. And then you get another one and it doesn't come back. Now, we say there's 33,000 stimulus reaction response cycles a day. That's about one every other second. When this starts happening, though, instead of having one every other second, you can have multiple in 1 second, because after a while, you are not reacting. And I distinguish reaction from response. So response is on the conscious mind side, and reaction is on the network of neurons side. Once you get past a certain point, you are now reacting to your own reactions. If you've ever seen a person crashing out, if you look at some of the quote unquote Karen videos where these people are just like losing it, you can see that they're not rational. They're not saying rational things. They are reacting to reactions. And what's going on is there's some sensation inside that's saying, this is very dangerous. This is like a tiger. You need to fight, 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 fight. And that they're just reacting to internal reactions. So when I talk about neuroplasticity, how does it solve this? We literally change those paths of least resistance. So instead of being able to react to reactions, it's as though we are inserting a pause, but it's not just that simple. We're breaking the fight or flight connection to everyday things. That's a better way to say it. The fight or flight, 300,000-year-old brain, that fight or flight is designed around fighting tigers. So you do need instantaneous reaction. You don't get the luxury of having 2 or 3 seconds to wait. You're, quarter second to fight this tiger. But when was the last time anybody had to fight a tiger? Closest I came was a tiger growling at me at the zoo. So you don't need that level of adrenaline. And by changing that, we change the bias of the network of neurons from 80 to 90% is threat bias to a 80 to 90% is neutral bias. And by changing that bias, it's no longer seeing things as a threat. This is sort of what happens. I don't talk about it like this, but in Ranger School, they break your your fear response. They break it by just pinging it over and over and over and over. It just goes away. It just breaks down. It's because you're not fighting a tiger. And I wanted to have something that we could get that same outcome without putting people through a crazy 8 weeks of training that, they're looking at 55% attrition rates, and they're intending the same with Navy SEALs. They're looking at such high attrition rates. There's got to be, I figured there has to be another way. And this is what we're talking about. So what we have to do with this is, ideally, we're going to be able to correct it here and get back to coherence. And this is done with creating a new path of least resistance. So where the path of least resistance used to be reacting to reaction to reaction to reaction, we now change that, and the path of least resistance is coming back down. And in people who've studied emotional intelligence, you understand this is regulation, but here's the challenge with emotional intelligence. With EI, it starts at conscious awareness. EI says, because it was created in the mid-90s, it says that you can't change your personality, you can't change your identity, you can't change your intelligence. And that was true at the time, but now that we know that activity-dependent myelination applies not only to muscle or to physiology, but it applies to cognitive processing, because the neural pathways are essentially the same. Now, when you go deep into emotional intelligence, you start talking about the parts of the brain, the amygdala hijacks the prefrontal cortex, you've got the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, and that doesn't help us, because how do you do something with your amygdala? How do you stop it from doing what it's conditioned to do? You don't. And the same problem happens with neuroscience. As they go deep into it, instead of getting actionable, they go into the parts of the brain, and then there's new terms. And you pick up any neuroscience book, there's constant new term after new term after new term. And what I'm doing is, what are the few things that you absolutely need to be able to do this? And that's why it's very possible. So emotional intelligence does talk about regulation. However, I would say that when you look at regulation, there's 3 parts. You have prevention adjacent, you have modulation, and you have corrective action. So because emotional intelligence is coming in so late at the conscious awareness side, it may feel like you're doing prevention and modulation, but in the context of cognitive processing, because cognitive processing doesn't start at the conscious mind side. Cognitive processing starts 100 milliseconds before the stimulus. In other words, the central nervous system is pre-listening. It's always predicting what might happen. So it's got this pre-listening thing going on, and the network of neurons is where your cognitive processing begins. So when you look at it from a prevention standpoint, the prevention has to be very early over here, but because the trajectory takes off quickly, I mean, you're going to process potentially 5 million bits of information in just this 1/2 second. And that trajectory takes off. So prevention is way over here. Inside here is modulation. By the time you get over here, it's corrective action. Let me say that again. When I look at emotional intelligence and it's talking about regulation, what I'm saying is this is actually corrective action because the horse has already left the barn. That's why I have this model to show that you have the pre-stimulus. So this would be steps 1 and 2 in the 7-step reset. And when you catch it early, the impact is very high for very, very small amounts of effort. You catch it so soon, you're able to make major changes in this trajectory. Once it gets here to this transition point, I have this as the present moment. This is where we are transitioning from a signal to words, because the conscious mind thinks in words, whereas the network of neurons is signal. But once it crosses over here, it takes a lot more effort. Now, in emotional intelligence, they'll talk about taking a deep breath, 100%. So all of those things that they talk about, they work. I don't throw anything out when it comes to emotional intelligence. In fact, so my deal is dynamic leadership. Dynamic leadership picks up where emotional intelligence dropped off or drops off. And the word dynamic is there because we're doing things in real time. The same way dynamic suspension, it feels like it's predicting the bumps in the road. It's not predicting the bumps in the road. It's just reacting so fast at the millisecond level that you don't notice the bump. And as the bumpy road changes degrees, it's always adjusting. The same way dynamic traction control or dynamic ABS is adjusting with a feedback loop. So the early days of ABS and the early days of traction control, it was really just one way. When the tires started skidding, the intervention would happen. On ABS, it would sort of modulate the brakes, and on traction control, it would interrupt the power. Later on, they started introducing braking, so the brakes actually come into play. And then they did more of a feedback loop, especially with motorcycles, because as motorcycles lean, the part of the tire is actually a smaller diameter as you lean. And so the algorithm changes as you're leaning. So it's using a feedback mechanism back and forth. So the traction control is dynamic, because what was happening was motorcycles would be on the gas, leaned over, and they'd hit that point where the tire was overspinning and it was too fast for the traction control to catch up. More than you probably wanted to know, but that's why it's called dynamic leadership, because we're doing it inside here. We're over here, we have preemptive priming. So we're priming the pre-stimulus. Simple thing to think about it is your perpetual question. Everybody's walking around with a perpetual question. And in those early days with the client, I am perceiving what they're inferring what their perpetual question is. And then we work with that, because if I can slow down the perpetual question, I start slowing down, or improve the perpetual question, I slow down some of the priming. But there's also steps 1 and 2. And we have to make sure we're in a state of coherence, and we'll do things to drive up coherence. I may have to do the positivity exercise. If they're really stressed out, we do some other things to get that coherence going. But anyway, this would be preemptive priming, which is this pre-listening period, the 100th of a second before the stimulus. Then the stimulus happens. So this first part is where we capture with the positivity exercise, and this would be dynamic interception. So we're literally intercepting so this by over here, it's rapid reaction formation, right? We're intercepting the trajectory dynamically. So we're catching it in here. How? By conditioning in with neuroplasticity. You can literally condition this stuff in, because it's all associations. You just have to you're using deep practice to create habits the same way habits are formed in the beginning, from 0 to 7. We're just applying it now intentionally based on what we want. And then this middle section is dynamic modulation. So I talked about the difference between prevention, modulation, and regulation, because we can still catch it in here. So this might be more perpetual question. It's more of the positivity exercise. This is happening really, really fast. Even probably before you feel a sensation, until you've been doing it a while. Once you've been doing it a while, you'll feel the sensation very early on. And then the middle part, so this is like 600 milliseconds, right? From 100 milliseconds before the stimulus, and then you add the half second. That's how I get 0.6 of a second, or 600 milliseconds. So I break it down into thirds. And this is where the neuroscientists, and I totally agree with them, will take exception to this because it's different for everybody. This 1 second model could be 1/10 of a second for somebody who's having a phobia response, and it could be 3 minutes for somebody who's trained as a monk. But the point is not the 1 second. The point is the things that go through. So it could collapse, but you're still rapidly going from a stimulus reaction response, and you could be expanded. So you have the preemptive priming, and then in the middle 200 milliseconds or 2/10, we have the dynamic modulation where we're catching it. This is like the traction control on the edge when the car is sliding or the motorcycle is about to slide and it's managing that traction right at the edge. And then here we have dynamic regulation. So I talked about regulation is more like corrective action. By this time, you're a little bit late. Over here, this we would also use some breathing. We can condition it, and there's a deep breath that you take a deep breath right away. Another thing you can do, if it's you, another thing you can do is just simply turn your head and look somewhere else, because you want to pull in external stimuli. If you keep looking at what you're looking at, your internal loop is going. By looking up, looking sideways, looking at something else, picking up a book and just opening a page, you're giving yourself an external stimulus. That's an intervention, and it gets started. If you wait too long, that doesn't work anymore. That's what I was talking about with the regulation being too late if it's over here. Taking a deep breath with emotional intelligence, that's the big thing. You take a deep breath to regulate. Well, guess what? If you take that deep breath too late, you need a whole lot of deep breaths. If you catch it here, one long breath through your nose, think about that. I just took a breath for over a second. And if this is happening multiple times in a second, just taking that, inhaling through my nose and exhaling slowly, I can use up 3 or 4 seconds. It interrupts it, and you can condition that in so it's an automatic reaction. And what will happen is when you do this after about 3 or 4 weeks, you will have much fewer episodes of any kind of anxiety. And then once we get into here, now we're using reframing because the conscious awareness is coming in. And you're using reframing, so now we're definitely into corrective action. So it's preemptive priming up here, that's like prevention. Then we have the dynamic interception, catching it quickly, and then we have the dynamic modulation, adjusting on the fly, and then we have the dynamic regulation. And this is all before emotional intelligence kicks in. And I'm not saying anything bad about emotional intelligence. They didn't understand this part. When emotional intelligence was created, this was still thought of as a mind. And if it's a mind, it's the you, and you're negotiating with it. Right? But now that we know it's a network of neurons, you're not negotiating it, but you're the programmer. You program it. You don't have to negotiate with it. And then we get over here, and we don't get to the response until out here, but the response formation happens. And I'll leave you with this last thing because it gets really interesting. It gets more complex. But if you think about this area, before you have pre-stimulus, after you have a response. This is the land of the network of neurons. This is the domain of the 11 million bits per second. So the more we can do on this side, the more we're going to do, because this is only 50 bits per second. So if you're trying to wrestle down a trajectory that started over here with the 50 bit per second conscious awareness, it's going to be tough. Over here, this pre-stimulus is where we leave the conscious mind. And over here in the response is where we re-enter the conscious mind fully. It starts here, but because this is my step 3 of the 7-step reset. This is step 4. Step 4 is clearly conscious mind, whereas step 3 is more of a transition between the two. But here, entering it, we use the perpetual question. And over here, we have a handoff protocol. So you may know this term, incubation, where you can give commands to your subconscious and then you go do something else and the subconscious comes back with answers. This is not woo-woo. This is not mystical mumbo jumbo. It's like prompting AI. Literally, you're putting a prompt into your subconscious and it's returning with information, because remember, it has this vast database from when you were a kid. And trillions of connections, 100 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of other neurons, makes trillions of connections. And so you can put a prompt on it and it'll come back to you with an answer. But what people hadn't thought about is that because we can condition what's going on in the network of neurons with deep practice, you can actually set a handoff protocol. So knowing that we don't really see tigers, knowing that we're not usually in a fight or flight situation, not a real fight or flight. We may be feeling, you may have the adrenaline and the cortisol, but it's not like if you don't answer that email, you're going to die. You know, I mean, most people can go through 5 years and not experience looking life and death in the face. Now, you know, the more time you get, the more that can happen. Obviously, people have been in combat and car accidents, etc. So obviously, I get it. But the point is, for most of us, we are not facing that kind of a life or death situation. So the handoff protocol, the one I use, is to hand off a clearly defined definition, a clear definition of the situation. And I'll get more into that with the 7-step reset. But I wanted to go through this because I wanted to let you guys know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. This is not an impossibility. It's not mystical mumbo jumbo. It's not some new wave thing or new age thing. This is the way we are wired. 300,000-year-old brain, neuroscience is in its infancy. It's not likely to change in my lifetime. And so, you know, I'm riding this one out into the sunset. The neuroplasticity, allostatic neuroplasticity, because it's not just neuroplasticity, it's neuroplasticity for above the line, which I'll get into when I talk about goal setting on Thursday. And goal setting is such a cool topic to talk about through the lens of neuroplasticity, because there's so many best practices around goal setting, and I can tell you how they relate to neuroplasticity. And I'll just keep coming back to that. We'll also be able to talk about some of the things like where the reticular activating system comes into play and why there's so much serendipity and or problems. You know, you set a goal and either you're getting serendipity or you're getting problems, right? All of that can be explained with neuroplasticity. I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but once you start seeing it through a lens of neuroplasticity, it gets easier and easier and easier. All right, that's it. I'm going to tune in on Thursday, and on Thursday, I'll give you the link where you can join me on stage. I can have 10 people on stage, which is a little bit better because then we can interact. And when I'm working in this neuroplasticity thing, I'm very, very much about needing to see the people, because all this here network of neuron side, it shows up in the face. You'll do this as coaches. You already use sensory acuity. What we have to do is get more comfortable with it, get better at interpreting, and you can't really interpret what it is. You just know when a shift happens. So what I do when I'm working with the client, I spend a lot of time in that first session calibrating. I make sure we're talking about things that are easy for them and comfortable. I get into their heart. I want to hear what their dreams and their passions are. I want to hear from them. And I get to the point where I'm hearing almost nothing from the network of neurons. And now, once I start working with them after that, I can spot it very quickly. I can tell when they get triggered, and that's when I back off. But more to come on that. We'll talk about goal setting. I'll get into some of the 7-step reset. And I wanted you to have this perspective about the right side of the pressure curve and why we want to avoid this and what we can do when it's over here. And over here, we're not trying to prevent it. We're trying to, in my opinion, we're proactively managing it. These are recoveries. You have to have some recovery time, or you have to have some divergence and convergence, right? You ebb and flow. You're not going to just keep pushing through it. But that's it. I'm going to sign off here. We'll see you Thursday morning, 8 o'clock Pacific time. That's Los Angeles if you're looking at the time zone charts. All right.